All right. So we're in the latter half of John chapter 5. What we kind of finished up looking at last week was the claims of Jesus, what he claimed to be. Of course, all of what we've seen leading up to this point, this is all pointing to who Jesus is. He is the Christ, he is the Messiah, he's the anointed one. And so some of the claims that he makes in John chapter 5 are things we've already seen quite a bit of. We see that, again, he is the Son, and the Son is from the Father. The Son does not do anything that the Father does not do. He only does what the Father gives him, and he gives authority in that manner. And so with that, you better honor the Son, because in honoring the Son, you honor the Father. If you dishonor the Son, you dishonor the Father. We looked at several passages regarding that, Acts 17, 2 Corinthians 5 being a couple of those. And then with that, some of the authority that is given to the Son gives life. He gives eternal life. You go back to John 3, John 4. These are living waters that Jesus offers, and it is only through him that those things can be attained. And we looked in verses 24 through 27. The Son will give spiritual life contingent on two things: to those that hear and those that believe. And we're going to flesh some of those ideas out a little more this morning as well. So coming to the kind of the latter half of the discussion here, verses 30 through 47, we have 5 witnesses that are brought to the stand. Some of these witnesses we've already seen. Some are going to be new in some respects. So basically what Jesus is saying in 30 through 47 is, you don't believe me, believe these witnesses that I'm going to present to you. And he leads them in one after another. The first we find in 30 and 31, and it's rather simple. Who's the first witness that we talk about?
Jesus himself?
Yeah, it's Jesus himself, exactly. And kind of what he's getting at there is, I myself bear witness, but I do not bear witness alone. And so it's even the sense of, if it was just me, that testimony would not be as strong if there were not other witnesses. But that's not the case. There are other witnesses, and we talked about some of those already. One witness that's already showed up twice, and this is the third and final time he's going to be presented. Who is presented after Jesus as witness?
John.
Which John? Right. John the Baptist. That's right. Yes. So again, recalling the credibility that John the Baptist had, how much people thought of him, the honor that had already been given him, and how he pointed to Christ, to Jesus being the Christ. We looked in verse 36, related to Jesus, what specifically was a witness with Jesus.
The works he did.
Right, the works that he did. And I think especially what we see there are the miraculous works that he did, pointing again to his identity of being the Christ. And then we finished kind of picking up here in verses 37 and 38. We have the fourth witness presented to us here, and that is the Father. The Father also bears witness. This is a claim that Jesus is going to repeat several times. We've already seen this crop up a few times. And the Father even appears in a very real sense on several occasions. At Jesus' baptism, the Mount of Transfiguration, and some of these are not going to be found in the Gospel of John, but in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We see later on, actually in John chapter 12, a voice thundering from heaven, and it says that the people actually heard that, but it sounded as thunderings from heaven, saying, "This is my beloved Son." And he bears witness in many other ways as well, as we'll see. Again, we saw back in John chapter 1, he is the perfect declaration of God, of the Father. And so there are other signs that we see associated with Jesus as well. In First John 4 and verse 12, the same author of the Gospel of John that we're looking at here says, "He who loves his brother has Christ, has God dwelling in him." So both of those dwelling in us if we love our brother. In the Gospel of John, again, in 5 and verse 38, it says, "They did not receive the word or let it dwell in them. Therefore, God did not dwell in them." Right? So receiving the word is part of how God dwells in us as well, and how he bears witness. So the Father bears witness. We see following the scriptures bear witness in verses 39 through 34. Within this reading, even though the scriptures bear witness of who Jesus is, it says the Jews did not love God, and so they did not receive his word. Again, going back to John chapter 1, the word was with God, the word is God. He was in the beginning with God. So they preferred, and we see this again many times, the Jews, the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they preferred the honor of one over another. That is the honor of God. They preferred the honor of men rather than the honor of God. Over in John chapter 12, verse 43, you see that borne out, as we'll come to in a few weeks. So they're happy to hear and receive anyone who validates what they're already doing in the traditions of men, and upholding false godliness, holiness. But when truth is presented, real truth is presented, and it's testified about, as Jesus is bringing forth here, they didn't want it. And we see that here. And this is all of what Jesus is giving is in response to accusations of that which the Jews are bringing, which is that Jesus is making himself equal with God. So that's the fifth witness the fourth witness that we have there. And then we have the fifth witness, Moses, in verses 45 through 47. So we have, in a very real sense, we have the prophets as it's borne out in Scripture, and then now we have the law. So we have the law and the prophets testifying of who Jesus is. There are several other passages we could go to that Jesus is drawing from. You think of all the things that Moses wrote. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 in particular, the three promises. That third promise, the seed promise. Through your seed, all the families, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Also in Genesis 22, that promise is given. You go over to Genesis 49 and verse 10. It reads, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people." So that, talking about that scepter shall not depart from Judah. It's that line, as we go to Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy, all the way leading to Jesus Christ. All the way back to Genesis 49. In Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 and 19, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." We brought up this passage earlier, and it's actually going to come up again in chapter 6, but that language of talking about a prophet like you, and that's speaking of Moses. So this is speaking of Jesus. They misapplied this earlier to John the Baptist. They were asking if he was the Christ. They were asking if he was Moses. They were asking if he was a prophet. All of these guesses as to who John the Baptist might be. And as it turns out, this applies to Jesus. One thing that is so important, and I know it's been stressed several times in this class and other classes and lessons, the Lord has chosen to communicate to us as his people with words, in language, in simple, easy to understand words. And he is wanting us to all reason together, to discern these things, to really think about these things, so that, as John is writing, so that we may come to believe. And of course, that belief leads to eternal life, which comes from the Son. But we have to have the kind of heart that will listen, that will take that in, that will discern it, that will understand those things. And so then finally in verse 47, he says, if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? I'm just going to throw this out to y'all. Does that remind you of any other passage, any other accounts in any of the other gospels? If you don't hear the law and the prophets, that's it. You don't believe that, there's nothing else. If you go over to Luke chapter 16, verse 29, very similar to the words given to the rich man in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man wants someone to be sent back to tell them that to his brothers, rather, to go back to his brothers and tell them, this is a fate that I do not want for them. To please tell them that they don't need to stay on the same course that I was on. And of course, the words that are given to him here is, if they don't believe the law and the prophets, then how are they going to believe that miraculous sign of someone being raised from the dead and going back to them? So if you don't receive these words, how are you going to accept? How are you going to receive the words of Christ? Right? All of this is pointing to Christ. These are all of the witnesses that back up the claims of Jesus. All right. That's chapter 5. I'm flying through that to get to chapter 6. Any other comments, questions we have on this chapter or moving forward? All right. Let's go on over to John chapter 6. Let me bring this one up real quick. Okay. So this is the section of the Gospel of John that we're still in. We're about to conclude the period of controversy, as we've titled it. John the Baptist, Jesus, others have identified Jesus as being the Son of God, and evidence has been presented. So now, as the ramifications of Jesus's claims become evident to the Jews and their leaders, there's going to be a lot of pushback, and we've already seen a little bit of that. There's going to be even more considerable pushback because of who Jesus is claiming to be. And so we come to, here in chapter 6, one of the most famous miracles in all of Scripture. And coincidentally, it is the only miracle that's recorded in every single gospel other than the crucifixion. The only one that's recorded. And I think that says something. And I think that says we need to hone in on this, maybe even more so than some of the others, if it's repeated in all of the gospels. So in verses 1 through 9, we do see that this is near the time of the Passover. This is actually one of 3 Passovers specifically mentioned in John. We've already talked about that. And so Jesus goes across the Sea of Galilee to a deserted place. So he was on kind of the northeast side of he goes across the Sea of Galilee to a deserted place near Bethsaida, where he teaches and heals the multitudes. That's in verses 1 through 4. In verse 2, then a great multitude followed him. That is, once he crossed over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and they saw the signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And then it says in verse 3, and Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And then verse 4 tells us we're in the Passover period here. And so he's teaching, he's healing multitudes. And Jesus asks Philip in verse 5 a particular question. What does he ask him here? And why does he ask this question? Right. And who is they? Who are we talking about now? Is it the disciples? Right. So this multitude, as a lot of the multitudes in the Gospels, they have continued to follow Christ. They're flocking to him. The crowds are growing much larger. So yeah, he sees this great multitude coming toward him. And yeah, he asks, where are we going to buy bread that these may eat? Verse 6 tells us even more of why he asked this question, and why, even more specifically, does he ask this question?
An opportunity to test them.
Right.
It's another miracle, another one of the witnesses.
It's another witness. It's another miracle. And in particular, in verse 6, and I think you mentioned this, he said this to test him. That is Philip. So and it's interesting. I don't know why he selects Philip in particular, but he does. And he asked this specifically to Philip. Again, I want us to realize this. Every word in Scripture, and especially every word given by Jesus, is given for an exact and precise reason. This is not random. It's not off the cuff. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. And he wanted Philip to think, he wanted the disciples to think, he wanted us to think about what's being talked about here. So then Philip gives a response in verse 7, and what does he say there in response to what Jesus asked him?
We don't have enough money to buy it. Food.
Right, yeah. It says that or Philip says, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. So I'm pretty sure this would have come up at some point in classes previous, but how much is a denarii or a denarius? Just one.
Days. Wages.
Yeah, day's wage, right? So this is Philip is saying we have 200 denarii. So that's about 2/3 of a person's yearly wage. We could estimate in that regard. So he says here, this was not enough to even supply this crowd of 5,000. This is, by the way, 5,000 plus, because this is only numbering the men. This was not even enough to supply an afternoon snack, much less a meal for them to be fully satisfied, as we're going to see. They're going to be fully satisfied as much as they want. And so in response to that, it seems that Andrew, one of the other apostles here, one of the other disciples, kind of overhears this, right? Because he's amongst, they're all with Jesus at this point. And what does Andrew offer? Verse 8. Or verse 8 and 9, rather.
Yeah, the fish, the 5 loaves of barley and the 2 fish.
Right. So Andrew, after hearing this, and this, of course, again, this is Simon Peter's brother, says and notices there is this lad, this small boy here that has 5 loaves and 2 fish available. So Andrew does this without being asked a question. So it seems that there's maybe a little bit of faith, but even then, Andrew says in verse 9, he says, we have this, but what are they among so many? So really, even he's not sure how this is going to turn out. He's not sure what Jesus is going to do with this, right? So we have 200 denarii. That's not going to work. We have 5 loaves and 2 barley or 2 fish. Not sure if that's going to work. Nonetheless, we see that Jesus says in verse 10, make the people sit down. And it says there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down in number about 5,000, the number we've already alluded to. Some of the other Gospels give us an indication of how they were sat down in 50s and 100s. And I think this is likely due to the fact this was just more convenient, more efficient. for the disciples as they disperse the food among the people here. This is a photo. Again, I've referenced some of these photos in the past from Farrell Jenkins on some of his travels to the Bible lands. But this was the site that's believed to have been the site of the feeding of the 5,000. And it again occurred near the time of the Passover on the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee. If you have a map still with you, I think you'll find that fairly easy to locate there. And I think I have a map in the slides here we'll get to here in a moment. But then this is even some of the grassy fields more on the very northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so you can look at all of just the vast expanse. And this is modern day also. And there's still all of this land. So you can imagine 5,000 plus being able to lay out on this land here. So we see in verses 10 through 15, Jesus gets to the point of performing this miracle. He takes the loaves, he takes the fish, and in verse 11, it says in particular that he gives thanks and he distributes them to the disciples to give to the multitudes. I was thinking about this the other day. In every single miracle, I think, even apart from John, we see Jesus doing it in a slightly different way every single time. With the water to wine, we see Jesus kind of commanding people to do things, to fill the pots, but never touching them himself. Here, he does end up touching them and then disperses them to the disciples. So sometimes he's delegating the miracle to the disciples, kind of working through them. Other times it's just him. We see he performed one 20 miles away in the healing of the nobleman's son. And so there's no way to repeat this if you're anyone but Jesus, right? He can do it in any way he wants to, any way that he likes. And so I think that's rather interesting. So after it's dispersed and after the disciples have gotten it, they pass it out. And in verse 11, just an awesome, just very small description here, but this is rather awesome. As they're passing it out, they had as much as they wanted. I don't know how long that lasted, 5,000 plus people, probably a whole day, maybe longer than a day. They had as much as they wanted, 5 loaves and 2 fish. You just think about, again, we're going to get to this in Jesus's explanation later in the book, but just how that translates to our spiritual needs. He provides enough and then some after that, just on and on and on. We're going to be continually filled up. There's not going to be any lack. We're not going to have any lack of spiritual need. They had as much as they wanted, and as long as we are willing to receive that spiritual food, it's always going to be available. And it will always fill us up. It will continue to fill us up. So then the people's reaction to this, so they were filled, and it says even then, they had as much as they wanted, and there were leftovers. There were more leftovers than what they started with. There were 12 baskets gathered at the end. So again, speaking to that fact of, and then some. There was enough and then some. So the people have a reaction to this. I think any of us would have a strong reaction to this. They have a rather strong reaction to it. They say here, as we've seen this title being given previously, they say that he is truly the prophet who has come into the world. Again, referencing Deuteronomy 18, as we looked at previously, it's talking about their sending a prophet like Moses to them. And you think, and this is going to come into play in Jesus' explanation, you think about some of the things that Moses did. He was the spokesman for God, and he was the one that told them manna would come from heaven. So they're thinking very much in that way, how Moses fed us in the wilderness. And now Jesus is doing this. Oh, this must be the prophet. Well, yes, they're thinking about that in the wrong way. They're thinking very physically, very carnally minded. And it even says here in these verses, they wanted to take him and make him a king. Again, thinking very physically here. They're still thinking of a physical kingdom, of a physical Messiah, the anointed one. We've already talked about this, but of course, Jesus is not going to be the kind of king that these Jewish believers want him to be. He's going to defy all of those expectations. They have certain expectations. He's going to meet those, but not in the way that they're thinking, not in the way they should be thinking. In Matthew 14, in verse 23, this is the one of the parallel passages to the feeding of the 5,000. So after he had sent the multitudes away, it says he went up on the mountain by himself, and it gives us a little more explanation here, by himself to pray. And now when evening came, he was alone there. So Jesus goes off alone. And one of the few times that we see Jesus going off without multitudes, without the disciples, without anyone. He is by himself. In John 18, in verse 36, talking about the nature of Jesus' kingdom, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. If Jesus was an earthly king, we would not see him fleeing, sending the multitudes away in Matthew 14 and in John chapter 6 here. He would have welcomed that, saying, this is now the time of my fulfillment. My kingdom is here. But that's not his purpose. He goes away, the exact opposite of what you would expect from an earthly king there. Let's see. Here we go. So this is the map that I was talking about. So we have been kind of here on the northeastern shore, kind of near Bethsaida, with the feeding of the 5,000. And now we're going to see Jesus is going to travel from that shore kind of to the northwestern shore near Capernaum. And he's going to travel there, and then eventually the multitudes are going to again follow him there. And that's where we're going to get this really lengthy but very powerful discussion about the nature of why Jesus did what he did, talking about the bread of life, as we're about to get to. But there's going to be kind of an interlude here, kind of a break. But before we do that, any comments we have on the initial feeding?
Just a personal comment.
Mm-hmm.
When I took my trip to Israel, we spent 3 days in Tiberias, and at least 2 or 3 days. And when we traveled all around those areas, so I have it very vividly in my mind. It's interesting.
Yeah.
There was one point that we went out to the sea, and my son Nathan says, I'm going to catch a fish. And anyway, he ended up catching a fish. It was funny, but that's another story for another time. But definitely, that's being able to be near the sea and speaking also, you can amplify voice is very interesting of why that had advantages there. So
it's interesting talking about. I know the women have that y'all have been involved in your geography study, and so it's very interesting. Yeah, looking at the geography, and it's such a throwaway comments of, oh, they traveled here. But again, each of those places I think are again there for a reason. And we can draw something from that, and there's benefit for us and why they went there in particular, why this happened in this particular place. So I think that's beneficial for us. Anything else? All right. So here we're going to have actually an event on the water. Again, one of John's themes, if you haven't picked up on it already, is water. He talks about that quite a bit. I think from chapter 1 till now, it's been in every single chapter that's been discussed in one way or another. So looking at verses 16 through 21. I know we haven't read any passages thus far, but someone read for us verses 16 through 21 of chapter 6.
American Standard? Or somebody else got it?
Whichever.
Okay.
Abby, you go ahead. Then
Now
I'll let him
evening
pick
came,
up.
his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. It was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. And the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going.
Okay. So, again, rather famous imagery that comes to our mind when thinking about the miracles of Jesus. If you're counting, this is going to be the fourth, I believe the fourth miracle that we're covering here. Or might actually be the fifth if I'm doing that right. Anyway, count yourself and you'll figure it out. It's one of those. In verse 16, so evening had come. So that kind of indicates to us, I think it's indicating this was the same day as the feeding of the 5,000. So this whole day had gone on and now it's evening. And his disciples went down to the sea. So they're not with him. They got into the boat and they went over the sea again toward Capernaum. We go back to our map. They're going again kind of northwestern there. Says again, it was already dark and Jesus had not come to them. And it says there, I believe it's here in John 6, the wind was contrary. I don't know if any of your translations read anything differently. Does anybody have anything different there? The wind was contrary.
Great wind was blowing.
Great wind was blowing. If you go over to Mark 6, Mark 6 in verse 48, it says, and this is Jesus, then he saw them, that is the disciples, straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. And now it was about the fourth watch of the night. He came to them walking on the sea and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and they cried out. And then it continues there. So again, kind of talking about there, the winds basically point here being the wind was boisterous. It was against them. They're straining. Maybe even they're thinking we're going to die because it's so bad. It's gotten so bad. And so Jesus identifies himself in this passage after after the wind has been going contrary to them for a little bit. He identifies himself. And what does he say in verse 20?
It is I. It is I.
It is I. Do not be afraid. For indeed they were. Not even so much because of the winds, it would seem there, but because they see this image of a person that's walking on the water. And as Mark 6 said, they think it's a ghost, a spirit. And then I guess you could count this as perhaps another sign, but I think it's involved in this sign. In verse 21, again, kind of a throwaway comment. I don't know exactly how this happened. As soon as they received him into the boat, they immediately arrived at land. I don't know how that works, but I would have been startled if it were me, if I was one of the disciples. And it seems that everything is calm now at this point. They are safely and securely on land. Again, this usage of John, or this usage of water by John, is very interesting. So here the water is boiling, it's tumultuous, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. But as soon as Jesus enters the boat, level ground. That all goes away. And there's an obvious lesson there for us in our lives. When our lives are chaotic, they're boisterous, things are uncertain, as soon as we focus again on Jesus, and What's not recorded here in John in the walking on the water, Jesus or Peter also walking on the water. As soon as his focus gets off of Jesus, that's when he begins to sink, right? Let our focus stay on Christ, and let him direct our lives, and he will bring that peace. He will bring that level footing always, if we trust in him. So it's a great lesson for us there. Any comments? Yes, Mr. Leary.
Could you imagine last night if you were out on a large body of water with wind like
I
we
know
had?
it. Yes.
I wanted to go out for a run right when this came up. I was debating it. I was in a car. As my car started getting jostled, I said, I probably need to go into the gym at night. But years ago, my dad taking me fishing was on the Tennessee River. It was a mile wide. And it's amazing what even a fair wind will do in terms of waves. That was terrifying. We almost didn't make it back across.
Yeah.
So that is a startling episode. You're thinking about your life, and then you see somebody walking on water at night. So
Yes. You think you might have already passed to the other side. That might be my thought process if I see something like that. I don't know what I would be thinking. But yeah, certainly, it gave them a lot to think about after this episode. And this is just on the heels of him feeding the 5,000, not to mention all the other things they had seen and witnessed. So very powerful. Anything else?
Well, in the boat, they were quite frustrated, rowing for, I don't know, hours. trying
Sure.
to go across the lake against the wind. And so back to your point, the whole time Jesus is watching us in our lives, and we're frustrated, and we don't realize that he's here watching us and waiting for us to ask him for help.
That's a good point.
All they had
Yeah.
to do was ask for help,
Mm-hmm.
and he would have done it.
That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah, he's watching over us. He cares for us. That's very much in line with, what we saw in Revelation. God knows, he sees, he cares for us. Certainly very, very important for us to remember as well. All right. This is what I expected. I didn't expect us to get through all of chapter 6 because this is a rather bulky chapter, but we'll enter into the discussion here on the bread of life, and then we'll pick it up next Sunday. So looking at verse 22, beginning in verse 22, it says, now we're on the following day. And when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no boat there except that one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, other boats had come from Tiberias near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum, seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? So those who had witnessed the miracle of the loaves and the fishes the day before, they come seeking Jesus, as they often do, following the one who has done these signs, and they ask, why did you come here? And then in verses 26 and 27, he begins to give an explanation for this. So he knows, based upon these verses 26 and 27, he knows they are not seeking him because of the signs, but rather because of what happened through the signs. They were filled because they ate the loaves. So he provided for food of upwards of 5,000 people. He could feed armies. He could feed, or he could bring this oppressive empire that's been over us and dominating us for years now. He could bring it to its knees. That's still where their mind is. Let's make this guy our king. Because look, he can feed us. He can feed armies. And he says here in verse 27, he exhorts them to labor, focus in on that word labor, because that's going to come up again, to fulfill their need for spiritual food instead of their desire for physical food. So the Son of Man would give them food which endures for everlasting life. But they still want the Messiah that's in their head, that physical king. That's still where their mind is. And it says, also interesting wording here at the end of verse 27, the God, the Father, has set his seal on the Son. God the Father has set his seal on him. So it's this kind of this seal of authentication, of giving, again, authority to the Son because of the signs that Jesus had done, because of the signs that Christ had done. So whatever the Son does, again, it's of the Father. Whatever he does, it's only of the Father. It's never anything outside of that. The will of the Son is the will of the Father. And part of that, part of what the Son wills to do is that he offers food which leads to eternal life. And so that's kind of opening this discussion about Jesus being the bread of life, opening up that discussion. We'll get into this next section and then we'll close this morning. Verses 28 through 31. So their response to this is, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? This is a very similar response as we've seen when Jesus gives a spiritual explanation and they come back with a physical response. We see that with Nicodemus. How can one be born again? We see this with the woman at the well. Give me this water also so that I may not have to draw water from here again. It's very similar thinking here. So then in verse 29, Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God. I might say this is the labor of God, that you believe in him who sent you, or in him whom he sent. So the people ask what works they should do to receive the bread Jesus offered. And Jesus responds, this is the work of God. Answering their question, but getting them to think still that you believe in him whom he sent. And if they had been paying attention, it's the one speaking, it's Jesus. And again, it's not just believing, but it's an active belief that they come to him, that they follow him, and that they follow the same authority that the Son is following there. So then in verse 30, they ask for a sign, another sign, after they've just seen a sign. What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. So again, they're thinking of Moses, the literal Moses. So they're kind of thinking of Jesus as this, it would seem, reincarnation, Moses 2.0 in a lot of ways, and also very carnally, this king. So they really like this guy, but they're still wanting proof, even though they've just seen proof. Which is very interesting. So again, they are very, very focused on their earthly appetites. If you go over to Philippians chapter 3, in verses 18 and 19 kind of reminds me of this passage. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you, even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. That is where their mind still was. They had not yet begun to discern who Jesus was, who Jesus truly was, in the signs that had been given. And so then we see there they recall again, manna was given in the wilderness. Okay, I think that's a pretty good stopping point for us this morning. We'll pick up in verse 32 as Jesus begins to give his lengthy response to the questions asked there. Any closing comments, questions that we have this morning? All right. We will finish there. We'll pick up again verse 32.